The day my stepmother legally became my mother, I was 42 years old and wearing a navy blue dress I'd bought on clearance at Nordstrom Rack. The judge looked at me over his reading glasses, the way you'd look at a paperwork error. "Miss Callahan, you understand what you're signing? At your age, this is unusual." Unusual. I'd been Celeste's stepdaughter for 19 years at that point. She married my father when I was 23, which meant she'd never once packed me a school lunch, never braided my hair, never sat through a parent-teacher conference pretending to care about my potential. She arrived fully formed in my adulthood, a sleek, smiling woman with champagne-colored hair and the particular warmth of someone who'd read books on how to be warm. And now, 2 decades later, she wanted to adopt me. You need to understand something about my father. Martin Callahan was a man who built things. Literally, he was a structural engineer. But he could never quite build the emotional architecture to say no to the woman he married. My mother had died when I was 19. Cancer, the kind that moves fast and takes everything before you've finished processing the diagnosis. It wrecked him. It wrecked me. And for 4 years, it was just the two of us. 2 people orbiting the same absence, making clumsy dinners, forgetting to take out the trash, leaving the Christmas lights up until March because neither of us could face taking them down. Then Celeste appeared. She was a paralegal at the firm where my father had his contracts done. 41, never married, no children. She laughed at his jokes, the same terrible engineering jokes I'd heard my entire childhood, and she didn't flinch when he talked about my mother. That was the hook, I think, the not flinching. They married 8 months after they met. I was finishing graduate school in Oregon at the time, working on my master's in library science, so I wasn't around for the engagement. I flew back for the wedding. Celeste hugged me at the reception and whispered, "I'm not trying to replace anyone." That was the first thing she ever said to me that I knew immediately was a lie. But I want to be fair. For the first several years, she was fine. Attentive to my father, polite to me at holidays. She redecorated the house, my childhood home, and I swallowed the sting of seeing my mother's wallpaper stripped from the kitchen. She didn't ask, she just did it. And when I came home for Thanksgiving, the kitchen was pale gray and white, like a showroom, like my mother had never stood at that counter, rolling pie dough with flour up to her elbows. I didn't say anything. I was 24. I didn't know yet that silence is a permission slip. The adoption idea came out of nowhere. My father called me on a Thursday evening in late September. I was living in Portland by then, working at the county library system, dating a man I would eventually not marry. My father and I talked every Sunday, same time, 7 o'clock his time, 4 o'clock mine. A Thursday call meant something was wrong. "Your stepmother has been thinking," he said. My father always called her your stepmother when he was about to deliver news he knew I wouldn't like, as if the possessive pronoun would soften it. She'd been thinking about family, about legacy, about what it meant that, legally speaking, I was not her daughter. "She wants to adopt you, formally, legally." I laughed. I actually laughed, standing in my tiny galley kitchen with a wooden spoon in my hand, stirring pasta sauce that was burning on the bottom. "Dad, I'm 42 years old. I don't need to be adopted. I'm a fully grown adult with a 401k. But he wasn't laughing. And that's when he told me the part that made everything shift. The part that should have been a warning bell, but instead just sounded like my father being his usual impractical self. The inheritance. My father's estate was significant. Not generationally wealthy, but substantial. The house in Marin County, the investment portfolio his own father had started, the life insurance policies, the cabin in Tahoe that had been in my mother's family for 3 generations. Everything, by default, would go to Celeste as his surviving spouse if he died first. And from Celeste, it would go to her nieces, Two women I'd met exactly once, at a Christmas party where they'd spent the entire evening taking selfies near the fireplace. Unless I was legally Celeste's daughter. Then the inheritance path flowed differently. Then I was protected. "She's trying to take care of you," my father said. "She's trying to make sure everything stays in the family. Our family." I stood in my kitchen with the wooden spoon dripping sauce onto the linoleum, and I felt something complicated. It was touching in a strange way. Unusual, yes, the judge would be right about that. But my father was 71. He was thinking about what came after. And Celeste, whatever her flaws, was apparently thinking about it too. I said yes. I flew down to Marin County the following month. We hired an attorney, Celeste's recommendation, a woman named Diane who worked in the same building as her old firm. The paperwork was thick and strange. Adult adoption is rare enough that the forms don't quite fit. Everything assumes a minor child, a dependent, someone who needs guardianship. Diane had to cross out minor in 17 different places and write adult in the margins. The hearing was brief. The judge asked me if I understood. I said I did. Celeste dabbed at her eyes with a tissue she'd clearly been holding for the photo opportunity. My father beamed, the way he'd beamed at my 8th grade graduation. Proud and a little confused, but mostly just present. The gavel came down. The papers were stamped. Celeste Callahan, formerly Celeste Morrow, became, legally, irrevocably, my mother. I didn't feel different. That was my first mistake. I assumed that because I felt the same, nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I just wouldn't know it for another 14 months. Because here's what I didn't know as I walked out of that courthouse with my adoption certificate in a manila envelope. What no one had told me, what Diane hadn't mentioned, what Celeste had been planning since the day she'd married my father and learned the exact structure of his estate. The adoption wasn't about making me her daughter. It was about making me her dependent. And the inheritance my father thought he was protecting? She'd already rewritten the path. For the first 8 months after the adoption, absolutely nothing happened. Celeste sent me a birthday card that year signed Mom, the word written in her careful, looping cursive, the quotation marks practically visible in the ink. I put it on my refrigerator for 3 days and then threw it away during a phone call with my father, which felt symbolic in a way I chose not to examine. I went back to Portland. I cataloged books. I broke up with the man I was dating, a perfectly kind accountant named Graham who wanted children and couldn't understand why a 42-year-old woman with a master's degree and a decent retirement account didn't share that urgency. He said I was emotionally unavailable. He wasn't entirely wrong. My father called every Sunday, same as always. Celeste occasionally picked up the extension. I'd hear the click and then her breath, soft and attentive, like someone listening to a podcast they'd already heard. She never said anything during those calls. She just listened. I told myself it was sweet. A stepmother so invested in her husband's relationship with his daughter that she wanted to hear both sides of the conversation. It's remarkable, the stories we tell ourselves to avoid discomfort. In February, my father had what the doctors called a minor cardiac event. He was 72, still working part-time as a consultant, still taking the stairs 2 at a time out of sheer stubbornness. The episode happened at a client meeting in San Francisco. He felt dizzy, sat down heavily in a conference room chair, and spent 3 days in the hospital while they ran tests and adjusted medications and used phrases like manageable with lifestyle changes. I flew down immediately. Celeste met me at the hospital entrance with a coffee, oat milk, which I'd never told her I drank, and a hug that lasted exactly 2 seconds too long. "He's going to be fine," she said into my hair. "He's going to be absolutely fine. We're going to take care of him together." The word "we" landed differently than it had before the adoption. Heavier. Like a door closing on a room I hadn't realized I was standing inside. I spent a week in Marin County. I slept in my childhood bedroom, which Celeste had converted into a home office with a pull-out sofa. My mother's bookshelves were gone. Her reading chair, a floral wingback she'd found at a flea market in Sausalito in 1979, had been replaced by a filing cabinet. I sat on the edge of the pull-out sofa at 2 a.m, running my hand over the wall where my mother had measured my height in pencil marks, and the wall was smooth, painted over. Celeste had painted over the growth chart. I didn't say anything. I was 42 years old. What was I going to do? Demand she repaint the wall to expose pencil lines from 1984? So I filed it, the way I'd filed the wallpaper, the reading chair, the way she said "we" about my father. But something shifted during that visit. My father, propped up in his hospital bed, with wires taped to his chest, grabbed my wrist with surprising strength as I was leaving. "The Tahoe cabin," he said. "It's in the trust. You know that, right? It goes to you. Always to you. Your mother wanted it that way." I told him I knew. I told him not to worry about things like that. But the look on his face, it wasn't worry. It was something closer to urgency. Like a man who just discovered his parachute might have a hole in it and was trying to tell me before the jump. The day after my father was discharged, Celeste took me to lunch, just the two of us. A wine bar in downtown San Rafael with exposed brick and menus printed on recycled paper. She ordered a Pinot Noir and a salad she didn't eat. She talked about estate planning the way other people talk about vacation rentals, casually, almost breezily, as if we were discussing whether to spend a week in Cabo. "Your father's attorney is updating everything," she said, spearing a piece of arugula and holding it in the air without bringing it to her mouth. "Now that we're legally one family unit, there are advantages, tax advantages, simplification opportunities." She used the phrase "one family unit" the way a corporate consultant might say synergy. I asked what needed simplifying. My father's estate had been structured for years. A living trust, clear beneficiaries, everything tidy. Celeste smiled. Not the warm smile she used at parties. This one was narrower, more precise. "The adoption changes things, sweetheart," she said. "Legally. You're not just his daughter anymore. You're our daughter, jointly. That shifts the inheritance architecture." Inheritance architecture. Those were the exact words she used, like it was a blueprint she'd been studying. I asked if I needed my own attorney. The question came out before I'd fully thought it through. Some instinct, some lizard brain suspicion firing before my conscious mind caught up. Celeste's fork stopped moving. She looked at me, and in that pause, in the space between my question and her answer, I saw something flicker behind her eyes. It was there and then it wasn't. A shudder, a recalibration. "Oh, I don't think that's necessary," she said, and her voice was back to smooth. "Diane is handling everything. You remember Diane? She did the adoption papers. She knows the whole situation." I remember thinking, the whole situation? What situation? What hole was she referring to? But I didn't push. My father had just come home from the hospital. He was fragile. He was sitting in his recliner in the living room, watching the Golf Channel with the volume too low. And all I wanted was to sit next to him and not talk about trusts or taxes or the legal architecture of family. I wanted to be his daughter, not his heir. I wanted the pencil marks back on the wall. So I went back to Portland. I returned to my routines. I let the conversation at the wine bar fade into the category of things I'd overthought. Celeste was a paralegal. Of course she talked about estate planning like it was casual. That was her language. That was her world. It didn't mean anything. And for the next 6 months, it seemed like I'd been right. My father's health stabilized. He and Celeste took a cruise to Alaska. They sent me a photo from the deck of the ship. My father in a puffy jacket, grinning. Celeste tucked under his arm, her champagne-colored hair whipped sideways by the wind. He looked happy. I felt something in my chest release, something I'd been holding since the hospital, since the painted-over growth chart, since the word "mom" in quotation marks. But here's what I didn't know during those 6 months of apparent calm. Here's what I wouldn't learn until much later, sitting at a conference table with my own attorney and the stack of documents that made my hands shake. Celeste hadn't been simplifying anything. She'd been restructuring everything. And the adoption, the adult adoption she'd pitched to my father as an act of love, as a way to keep the family intact, as protection for me, was the key that unlocked the entire mechanism. In the months before my father died, we had exactly one conversation that, in retrospect, was him trying to tell me something. I missed it completely. Not because I wasn't listening, but because my father and I had spent 3 decades communicating in the language of engineering metaphors and comfortable silences. And this particular warning didn't sound like a warning at all. He called on a Tuesday, not a Sunday, the second Tuesday call in 20 years. "I signed some papers today," he said. His voice was tired. Not sick tired, something else. The kind of tired that comes from signing things you don't fully understand but have been told are routine. Celeste's attorney, Diane, you remember Diane, she came by the house. Everything's consolidated now. One trust. Clean lines. Clean lines. That was an engineering phrase. My father believed in clean lines the way other men believed in God. "What does consolidated mean, Dad?" A pause. I heard the recliner creak, the same recliner he'd had since 1998, the one my mother used to threaten to throw away. "It means the cabin's in the trust now," he said. "Everything's in the trust. Celeste is the trustee. But you're the beneficiary, sweetheart. After we're both gone, it all goes to you. It's simpler this way. Fewer pieces." I remember pressing the phone harder against my ear, like I could physically push through the static of his vagueness. The Tahoe cabin, my mother's cabin, the one he told me in the hospital would always go directly to me, was now in a trust controlled by Celeste. "Dad, did you talk to anyone else before you signed? An independent attorney?" He made a sound that was almost a laugh, but wasn't. "It's Celeste. She's your mother now, legally. She's not trying to... She wouldn't..." He trailed off. I waited. The silence stretched. "I just wanted everything to be clean for you," he said finally. "No probate, no mess. You deserve clean lines." I should have flown down that weekend. I should have found him an attorney, a real one, someone who wasn't Diane from Celeste's old firm. But I didn't. Because my father sounded tired but not afraid. Because I had a library budget meeting on Thursday. Because the adoption was supposed to protect me. That was the whole point. And I couldn't hold suspicion and trust in my head at the same time. So I chose trust. I chose to believe that Celeste was, in her strange and overbearing way, doing exactly what she'd said she was doing. Taking care of me. Keeping things in the family. I told my father I loved him. He said he knew. We hung up. That was January 17th. He died on March 4th. But I'm not ready to tell you about March 4th yet. Because before we get there, before the funeral and the attorney's office, and the moment I finally understood exactly what I'd signed in that courthouse, I need to tell you what was happening behind the scenes, what I wouldn't discover for months, what Celeste had been building, piece by piece, since the day she'd learned the full scope of my father's estate. Here's what I now know to be true. 3 weeks after the adoption was finalized, Celeste met with Diane, not at the law office, but at a restaurant in Sausalito, a quiet place with water views and tables far enough apart that no one could overhear. Diane brought a draft document, a restatement of the Martin Callahan Living Trust. Diane had been my father's estate attorney for 6 years at that point. She drafted the original trust. She knew every provision, every beneficiary designation, every protective clause my father had insisted on after my mother died. And she helped Celeste dismantle every single one. The original trust had been straightforward. If my father died first, the marital assets would provide for Celeste during her lifetime. She could live in the house, spend the income from the investment accounts, maintain her standard of living. But the principal, the house, the portfolio, the Tahoe cabin, would pass to me upon Celeste's death. It was a common structure. Protect the surviving spouse, preserve the inheritance for the children. My father had been meticulous. He'd wanted me to have my mother's cabin. He'd wanted the Callahan portfolio to stay in the Callahan line. The restatement that Celeste and Diane drafted did something else entirely. Under the new trust, Celeste was no longer a lifetime income beneficiary with limited powers. She was the sole trustee and the primary beneficiary, a subtle but devastating shift. As trustee, she had the authority to distribute assets to herself for health, education, maintenance, and support. That phrase, health, education, maintenance, and support, is the legal equivalent of a blank check. It means almost anything. A new car is support. A vacation is maintenance of well-being. Remodeling the kitchen is health of the home. But the truly catastrophic provision, the one that Diane buried on page 43 of a 60-page document, the one my father almost certainly never read, was the clause about successor beneficiaries. The original trust had named me directly, irrevocably. The new trust named Celeste as the sole lifetime beneficiary, and after her death, the remainder would go to the then-living issue of Celeste Callahan, per Stirpes. Read that again. The issue of Celeste Callahan. Not Martin Callahan. Celeste. And I was not Celeste's issue. I was her legally adopted adult daughter, but I was not her descendant. I was not of her blood. And the trust language, carefully, surgically, made no provision for adopted adult children. In one stroke, my inheritance had been rerouted. Everything, the Marin County house, the investment accounts, the life insurance, my mother's Tahoe cabin, everything would go to Celeste, outright. And when Celeste died, whatever remained would pass to her nieces, the 2 women taking selfies by the fireplace. I had been written out of my own father's estate. And the adoption, the beautiful, unusual, bonding legal act that was supposed to protect me, was the weapon Celeste used to do it. Because here's the part that makes my stomach cold even now. When my father asked questions, and I believe in his way he did ask questions, Celeste had the perfect answer. Don't worry, Martin. I adopted her. She's my daughter now. Everything will go to her eventually. This just simplifies the path. And she could point to the trust language that said issue and tell him it covered me. She could smile. She could bring him tea. She could be the woman who'd never flinched at the mention of my mother. He believed her. Of course he believed her. She'd spent 19 years building the architecture of that trust, and he'd signed the final beam into place without ever seeing the collapse it was designed to create. My father died on a Thursday morning. I got the call at 6:47 a.m. Pacific time. My phone buzzing on the nightstand, Celeste's name on the screen, and I knew before I answered. You know, something about the hour, something about the way the phone vibrated against the wood, insistent and terrible. She was crying. Real tears, I think. I want to be fair about that. I believe, in her way, she did love him. He was easy to love. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays and fixed things that were broken and never raised his voice. The heart attack had come in the night. Massive. Quick. The paramedics said he probably never woke up. I packed a bag. I got on a plane. I didn't eat for 36 hours. The funeral was held at a small Episcopal church in San Rafael, the same church where my parents had been married, where I'd been baptized, where my mother's memorial service had emptied me out 19 years earlier. I sat in the front pew next to Celeste, who wore a black dress I'd never seen before and clutched a handkerchief that stayed entirely dry after the opening hymn. She kept reaching for my hand. I kept letting her take it. I was too hollow to resist. My father had been a beloved man. The church was full, colleagues from his firm, neighbors from 30 years, the couple who owned the hardware store where he bought everything, even when it was cheaper at Home Depot. I gave a eulogy. I talked about the pencil marks on the wall. I talked about the Christmas lights he left up until March. People laughed in the right places and cried in the right places, and through all of it, Celeste sat perfectly still, nodding occasionally, like a queen accepting condolences for a king she'd already replaced. The will reading happened 11 days later. That's not a thing that actually happens in real life. People don't gather in a wood-paneled office while a lawyer reads dramatically from a document. But what did happen was nearly as theatrical. Celeste called me and said Diane wanted to meet with us both, to review the estate documents, to make sure everyone understood the path forward. I flew down again. I sat in Diane's conference room, a sleek, glass-walled space with views of the Golden Gate Bridge, across from Celeste, who wore a dove-gray blazer and a string of pearls I recognized. My mother's pearls. The ones my father had given her on their 10th anniversary. The ones she'd said she wanted me to wear at my wedding. Celeste had found them in my father's closet. She'd decided they suited her. I didn't say anything. My father had been dead for less than 2 weeks. I was still having dreams where he was alive and waking up to the fresh amputation of remembering he wasn't. I didn't have the capacity to fight about pearls. Diane opened a thick leather folder and began to explain the restated trust. She used phrases like streamlined estate vehicle and surviving spouse protections and the natural consequence of consolidation. She spoke in the careful, rehearsed language of someone who'd practiced this conversation in a mirror. And for the first 10 minutes, I didn't understand what she was telling me. Then she said the phrase, Celeste's sole discretion as trustee. I sat forward. What does that mean exactly, sole discretion? Diane glanced at Celeste, a quick, instinctive look, the kind you give someone before you answer a question you both knew was coming. It means, Diane said, that as trustee, Celeste has the authority to manage and distribute trust assets according to her judgment. The trust provides for you, of course. You're named as a contingent beneficiary. She smiled. It was a professional smile, sealed at the corners. A contingent beneficiary after Celeste's death, I said, not a current beneficiary. The smile tightened. I asked about the Tahoe cabin, specifically, by name. Diane flipped through pages, adjusted her reading glasses, made a small humming sound. The cabin, she said, is part of the trust corpus. It's not designated to any specific beneficiary outside the trust structure. As trustee, Celeste has decision-making authority over all real property. I turned to look at Celeste. She met my eyes. Her face was arranged in an expression of gentle, patient sorrow. The face of a widow who was being forced to discuss legal matters while still deep in grief. But underneath it, in the muscles around her jaw and the stillness of her hands folded on the table, I saw something else entirely. Satisfaction. The adoption, I said slowly. The adoption was supposed to protect me. That was the whole reason. Celeste reached across the table. I pulled my hand back before she could touch it. "Sweetheart," she said, and the word landed like a paper cut. "The adoption made you my daughter, and as my daughter, you are provided for. When I'm gone, everything that remains will come to you. That's what your father wanted." Everything that remains. Those 3 words did more work than entire paragraphs of the trust document. Everything that remains. Not everything. Not the principal. Not the assets my father had spent a lifetime building. Whatever Celeste didn't spend, didn't sell, didn't gift, didn't transfer, whatever she chose to leave behind, that would come to me. And she could live another 30 years. She could drain every account, sell every property, rewrite every clause. She was the trustee. She had sole discretion. The restated trust was a fortress, and I was standing on the outside, looking in. I asked for a copy of the full trust document. Diane hesitated. "It's quite lengthy," she said. "Over 60 pages. "I'm a librarian," I said. My voice was calm. "I don't know how. I read long documents." She made me a copy. I took it back to my hotel room. I sat on the bed with the document in my lap and a yellow highlighter I'd bought at a Walgreens on the drive over. And for 6 hours, I did what my father had not done. I read every word. What I found was worse than what Diane had described. Much worse. The trust didn't just name Celeste as trustee. It named Diane as successor trustee, which meant if Celeste died, Diane would control the administration. The trust contained a no-contest clause, a provision stating that any beneficiary who challenged the trust's validity would forfeit any inheritance they might have received. This meant I couldn't sue. I couldn't contest. If I did, I would lose even the crumbs of Celeste's eventual leftovers. And the trust explicitly defined issue as biological descendants, a definition buried in an appendix, cross-referenced in a footnote, placed exactly where an exhausted, trusting, 72-year-old man would never find it. I was legally Celeste's daughter, but I was not her issue, and the trust made sure that distinction was a locked door. My father had wanted clean lines. He'd wanted me protected. And instead, he'd signed a document that handed everything, every house, every stock certificate, every photograph in every dusty album, to a woman who had been planning this for 2 decades. But Celeste made one mistake. One small, human, catastrophic mistake. She'd spent so long planning the legal architecture that she'd forgotten to plan for the librarian. The thing about being a librarian, a real librarian, the kind with a master's degree and 15 years of experience in county systems, is that you don't just know how to read documents, you know how to find them. Every document leaves a trail. Every revision has a predecessor. Every restated trust has an original trust. And original trusts, unlike restated ones, don't get filed in sleek leather folders in Diane's glass-walled office. They get filed at the county recorder's office, where anyone, any citizen, any daughter, any librarian, can request a copy. I spent the week after my father's funeral at the Marin County Recorder's Office in San Rafael. It's a low, beige building with fluorescent lighting and the particular smell of old paper and toner cartridges. I've spent my professional life in buildings like that. They feel like home to me in a way Celeste's dove gray blazer and my mother's stolen pearls never could. I requested everything. The original trust from 2008, every amendment, every deed transfer, every property record tied to my father's name, my mother's name, the Callahan Family Trust. It took 3 days and $240 in copying fees. The clerk, a woman named Rosa with silver braids and the unhurried competence of someone who'd been doing this job for 30 years, brought me stack after stack of paper. At one point, she looked at me over the top of the piles and said, "Someone's been busy, honey." She didn't mean me. Here's what I reconstructed, document by document, sitting at a laminate table under flickering lights. The original trust, the one my father had drafted with a different attorney, a man named Gerald Hoffman who'd retired to Arizona in 2015, was exactly what my father had always told me it was. The house in Marin County to Celeste for her lifetime, then to me. The investment portfolio to provide for Celeste during her lifetime, with the principal preserved for me. The Tahoe cabin, specifically, explicitly, in a separate provision with its own bolded header. To my daughter, Nora Callahan, absolutely and outright, as her sole and separate property. My mother's cabin. My mother's wording, probably, when she and my father had first done their estate planning. Young parents with a toddler, and the particular urgency of people who just realized they were mortal. The restatement, the document Celeste and Diane had drafted, had been recorded in 2022, 15 months before my father died, 3 weeks after the adoption was finalized. The timeline sat in my stomach like a stone. But it was the deed records that made me stop breathing. The Tahoe cabin, my mother's cabin, the one my father had told me in his hospital bed would always go directly to me, had been transferred into the trust in 2022. Before the restatement, it had been held outside the trust. It was a separate asset. It wasn't subject to any trustee's discretion. My father had set it up that way on purpose, a gift from my mother's family, kept separate, kept safe, kept mine. The transfer into the trust had required my father's signature, and it was there, on the deed, his signature, a little shaky, dated 3 weeks before he died. The signature of a man on new cardiac medications, a man who just signed a stack of papers his wife's attorney had brought to the house. A man who'd called me on a Tuesday and said, "I signed some papers today," and sounded tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. He didn't know what he was signing. He trusted his wife. He trusted Diane. He'd been told, I am certain of this, that the transfer was administrative, a formality, just part of the consolidation, clean lines. Clean lines. The phrase he'd used on the phone. The phrase Celeste had fed him, I'm sure of it now, because she knew exactly what language would make an old engineer stop asking questions. But there was something else in those deed records, something that made my hands go cold on the laminate table. The Tahoe cabin wasn't just in the trust, it had been refinanced. In 2023, 6 months before my father died, Celeste, acting as trustee, had taken out a home equity line of credit against the cabin, $420,000. The documents showed the funds had been deposited into a joint account, an account my father's name was on, but only Celeste managed. And from there, the money had been moved, in chunks, over months. $30,000 to a contractor in Palm Springs, the contractor who'd been remodeling Celeste's sister's vacation home. $50,000 to an investment account in Celeste's name only, titled as a gift. $22,000 to the nieces, the selfie-taking nieces, with the memo line, educational expenses, even though both of them had graduated college years earlier. She was looting the estate while my father was still alive. I sat in the recorder's office with these papers spread around me like evidence from a crime scene, which is exactly what they were, and I felt something shift. The grief didn't go away. It never goes away. But underneath it, something else was hardening, something that felt almost like relief. Because now I understood. Now I had the paper trail. Now the librarian had something the paralegal hadn't expected. Proof. I hired an attorney, a real one, not Gerald Hoffman, who was playing golf in Scottsdale and couldn't take the case, but a woman he recommended named Rebecca Torres. Rebecca was 53, sharp as a scalpel, and specialized in trust litigation. When I laid the documents out on her conference table, a real conference table, not the glass-walled stage set Diane had used, Rebecca was quiet for a long time. Then she looked up at me and said, "Your stepmother made a very large mistake." "Tell me," I said. Rebecca walked me through it. The no contest clause in the restated trust was formidable. Diane had been thorough on that front, but it had a vulnerability. A single, narrow, devastating vulnerability. No contest clauses don't apply to claims based on fraud. They don't apply to claims based on undue influence. And they don't apply when the trustee has breached her fiduciary duty so flagrantly that the trust itself has been compromised. Celeste had refinanced a property inside the trust for personal gain. She'd transferred trust assets to her relatives. She'd used her authority as trustee to enrich herself at the expense of the contingent beneficiary, me. Every one of those transfers was a breach of fiduciary duty. Every one of them was documented. Every one of them was a separate count. "But here's the most important part," Rebecca said, tapping the copy of the original trust, the 2008 document, the one my father had signed with Gerald Hoffman. "The restated trust was signed in 2022. Your father was on new cardiac medications. He'd been hospitalized. His medical records show he was experiencing what the doctors called episodes of confusion in the weeks after his discharge." She paused. "We can argue he lacked testamentary capacity when he signed the restatement. We can argue undue influence. We can argue fraud." "And if we win?" "If we win," Rebecca said, "the restated trust is void. The original trust is reinstated. The Tahoe cabin is yours outright. The house is yours after Celeste's lifetime. The portfolio principal is preserved for you. And Celeste has to account for every dollar she took." I thought about Celeste, about the pearls, about the painted-over growth chart, about the word mom in quotation marks, about the way she'd reached for my hand at the funeral, and the way the handkerchief stayed dry. "Do it," I said. "File everything." The lawsuit landed on Celeste's doorstep on a Tuesday morning in June, 4 months after my father's death, 2 months after I'd sat in the county recorder's office and watched my inheritance reassemble itself out of paper and ink and the particular stubbornness of a woman who'd been underestimated her entire life. Rebecca had filed 3 counts: breach of fiduciary duty, undue influence, fraud in the inducement. Each count was supported by documentation: the deed transfers, the refinancing records, the account statements showing money flowing from the trust to Celeste's relatives. We didn't have to argue about obscure legal definitions of issue or descendant. We didn't have to touch the no contest clause at all. We just had to show the judge what Celeste had done with the Tahoe cabin, with the home equity line, with the money that was supposed to be preserved for the contingent beneficiary. The fraud exception rendered the no contest clause irrelevant. Rebecca had been right. Celeste's mistake wasn't the adoption. It wasn't the restated trust. It was the greed. She couldn't wait. She'd started spending before my father was cold in the ground, before he was even in the ground, and every dollar she'd taken was a dollar she had to explain. The mediation happened in September, a windowless conference room in a downtown San Francisco office building, neutral territory. Celeste sat across the table from me for the second time that year, but this time she wasn't wearing my mother's pearls. She was wearing a gray suit that looked borrowed, a little too large in the shoulders, a little too short in the sleeve, and her champagne-colored hair was showing an inch of white at the roots. Grief, or the appearance of it, had stripped away the polish. Diane was there, representing Celeste. She'd stopped being the neutral family attorney somewhere around the point where Rebecca had named her as a witness to the restatement and suggested, gently, professionally, that Diane might want her own lawyer. She had one now, a man in a navy suit who whispered in her ear every time Rebecca spoke. The mediator, a retired judge named Harold, went back and forth between our rooms for 6 hours. I drank terrible coffee. I stared at a watercolor print of the Golden Gate Bridge. I answered Rebecca's questions in the same calm voice I'd used in the recorder's office, cataloging every wrong like a book I was processing for acquisition. And then, at 4:30 in the afternoon, Harold came back with Celeste's offer. The Tahoe cabin. Returned to me, outright. Free and clear of the trust, free and clear of the home equity line, Celeste would pay off the balance from her personal accounts. The original trust reinstated, with me as the direct beneficiary of the Marin County house and the remaining investment portfolio after Celeste's lifetime. And Celeste would resign as trustee. An independent fiduciary would take over, a neutral third party who would manage the assets and make sure nothing else disappeared. What about what she already took? I asked. Rebecca smiled. It was not a warm smile. The $420,000 from the cabin refinancing? The payments to her sister's contractor? The gifts to the nieces? She tapped the folder in front of her. She's agreeing to repay all of it. A full accounting. Every transfer, every withdrawal, every dollar. She has 90 days. I sat with that for a long moment. The watercolor bridge blurred. The coffee had gone cold in its paper cup. I thought about my father, signing papers he didn't understand on a Tuesday afternoon, trusting the woman who'd promised to take care of his daughter. I thought about my mother's growth chart, painted over, her pearls, stolen, her cabin, her family's cabin, the one place that still smelled like pine and childhood, and the ghost of a woman I'd lost at 19. I thought about the fact that it was almost gone, that Celeste had almost taken that too. And I thought about the word almost. She gets to keep the house? I asked. The Marin County house? For her lifetime, Rebecca said. That was the original deal. You can't disinherit a surviving spouse completely. California law won't allow it. But she doesn't own it. She can't sell it. She can't borrow against it. She lives there, and when she dies, it comes to you. She paused. Along with whatever's left of her own assets, which won't be much after she pays us back. I wanted more. I wanted her exposed. I wanted her humiliated. I wanted everyone at the country club and the wine bar and the church in San Rafael to know exactly what she'd done. But Rebecca had been very clear about the choice in front of me. I could take this settlement, guaranteed, enforceable, the cabin returned within 60 days. Or I could go to trial. Trials take years. Trials cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees. Trials are decided by judges who might see things differently. And trials, Rebecca reminded me, mean Celeste can keep spending while we fight. The settlement stopped the bleeding. The settlement was a tourniquet. I took the deal. The cabin was mine by November. I drove up on a Saturday morning, the first Saturday after the paperwork cleared, and parked in the same gravel driveway my mother had parked in when I was 6 years old. The pine trees were the same. The smell was the same. The key turned in the lock, and the door opened, and the light fell across the stone fireplace exactly the way it had in my memory. I stood in the doorway and didn't move for a very long time. My mother's quilt was still on the back of the couch. Celeste had never been here. She'd only wanted the money the cabin could produce, not the cabin itself. She'd never sat in this room. She'd never touched these things. The quilt was dusty. I shook it out and wrapped it around my shoulders, and it still smelled faintly, impossibly, like my mother's perfume. Around here, we don't just survive it, we understand it, and then we let it go. I won't pretend it was a clean victory. Celeste still lives in my childhood home. She still wears my mother's pearls to church. Someone from the old neighborhood told me that, and I won't pretend it didn't sting. She still tells people I'm ungrateful, that I sued my own mother after she'd just lost her husband, that the adoption was an act of love and I'd repaid it with litigation. Some people believe her. Some people always will. But the cabin is mine. The portfolio's protected. The independent trustee sends me quarterly statements, and I watch every transaction like a hawk. And Celeste had to liquidate her own retirement account to pay back what she'd taken. Her nieces didn't get to keep their educational expenses. Her sister's contractor had to be paid from her own funds she now doesn't have. The Tahoe cabin's home equity line is closed. The debt is gone. The title is clean. Here's what I know now, at 43, with my mother's quilt on my lap and a fire in the same stone fireplace that has warmed 4 generations of my family. The adoption was supposed to make me Celeste's daughter. It was supposed to bind me to her, legally and forever, in a way she could use. But what it actually did, what she never anticipated, was make me impossible to ignore. As her legal daughter, I had standing to challenge the trust in ways I might not have had as a mere stepchild. As her legal daughter, I had rights she couldn't dismiss. As her legal daughter, I was visible to the law in a way she couldn't erase. She tried to use the adoption as a weapon, and it was a weapon, but weapons can be turned. I didn't get everything back. I didn't get my father. He's still gone, and some mornings that loss is still the first thing I feel before I open my eyes. I didn't get an apology. Celeste has never admitted to anything, and she never will. I didn't get justice in the loud, cinematic sense, but I got the cabin. I got my mother's quilt. I got the satisfaction of watching a woman who'd spent 20 years planning the perfect theft realize, in a windowless conference room, that the librarian had read every page she tried to hide. My father wanted clean lines. I gave him clean lines. It just took longer than he'd hoped. Now, before I go, I want to say something directly to you, because I know some of you are sitting in your own version of that conference room. Maybe you're holding a document you were told not to worry about. Maybe you've been promised something by someone who has every incentive to break that promise. Maybe you trusted the wrong person, a spouse, a step-parent, a sibling, a friend, and you're only now realizing what that trust might cost you. Here's what I need you to hear. You are not being difficult. You are not being paranoid. You are not dishonoring anyone's memory by asking questions. Read the documents. Hire the attorney. Take the meeting. Walk into the recorder's office and ask for the paper trail. You don't need to be a paralegal. You don't need to be a lawyer. You just need to be someone who refuses to look away. Because the people who depend on your silence, they're counting on you staying quiet. They're counting on you trusting. They're counting on you being too polite, too tired, too grief-stricken to fight back. Prove them wrong. Not with screaming, not with drama, with documents, with patience, with the kind of quiet, precise, unshakable resolve that doesn't make a sound until the gavel comes down. That's the kind of revenge that lasts. If this story hit somewhere you didn't expect, if you found yourself nodding along or tearing up or thinking of someone specific, then you already know this channel is for you. Subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one. Stories about inheritance theft, about family betrayal, about the particular cruelty of people who are supposed to love us. You are not watching these alone. Every view, every comment, every person who hits that subscribe button, you're part of a community of women who have been through it, who understand it, and who refuse to let it define them. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have taken the settlement? Would you have gone to trial? I read every single one, and I want to know. Some stories don't end with an apology. They end with a boundary, and that's enough. The Firelight is always on. I'll see you next time.